We've all been told the myth of the unbothered avoidant, the person who walks away from a breakup with their head held high, seemingly indifferent, while you're left picking up the pieces. We assume they have a superpower for detachment, but there is a specific kind of loss, a specific depth of connection that doesn't just ping their defenses, it bypasses them entirely. When an avoidant loses that person, the walls don't just go up, they cave in. They don't just move on, they experience a psychological ego collapse that changes them forever. The common perception of the avoidant partner is one of immediate resilience and an almost robotic ability to detach. When a relationship ends, they often seem to be the first ones back at the gym, the first ones back on the dating apps, and the most vocal about how much they value their newfound peace. This creates a devastating illusion for the person they left behind, making it appear as though the connection meant nothing to them. However, this is rarely a sign of healing or strength. It is a manifestation of the delayed grief bomb. Because their primary survival mechanism is the suppression of vulnerability, they don't actually process the loss in real time. Instead, they store it in a psychological vault, convinced that if they simply keep moving, the door to that vault will remain locked. They aren't moving on, they are outrunning the shadow of their own emotions. This initial phase is characterized by a phantom freedom that feels like a victory. To the avoidant, the removal of the partner feels like the removal of a weight or a source of constant expectation. They mistake the absence of immediate pain for a sign that the relationship wasn't that significant. During this period, their nervous system is actually in a state of high-functioning shock. They are operating on a cocktail of relief and adrenaline, convincing themselves that they have finally reclaimed their autonomy. While the anxious partner is at home crying and analyzing every text, the avoidant is enjoying a temporary high, fueled by the belief that they have successfully escaped the trap of intimacy without any personal cost. The problem with this defense mechanism is that it has an expiration date. Grief is a physiological debt that eventually must be paid, and for the avoidant, the interest on that debt is astronomical. As the weeks or months pass, the relief begins to sour into a hollow sense of isolation. The distractions that worked in the first week, the long hours at work, the casual flings, the solitary hobbies, start to lose their shine. Without the emotional anchor of the partner they lost, the avoidant begins to drift into a space of profound loneliness that they weren't prepared for. The wall they built to keep the pain out has now effectively trapped them inside with it, and the silence of their life starts to become deafening. When the delayed grief finally detonates, it is often far more catastrophic than a standard breakup, because it is coupled with a sense of total confusion. Because they didn't feel the pain immediately, they don't always connect their current misery to the person they lost months ago. They find themselves spiraling into a deep depression or a state of chronic anxiety without understanding the source. This is the moment the clean break myth is shattered. They realize that they didn't actually move on. They simply froze their emotions in time. And now that those emotions are thawing, they are hitting all at once. The collapse happens because they lack the emotional tools to navigate a backlog of months of suppressed sadness, regret, and longing. The most painful part of this keynote is the realization that by the time the avoidant falls apart, the other person has often already done the hard work of healing. The avoidant reaches the peak of their suffering just as their ex-partner is reaching a place of indifference or closure. This creates a secondary trauma for the avoidant, the realization that they are now alone in their grief. They find themselves standing amidst the rubble of their own making, watching the person they once took for granted build a new life. This is why they don't just heal, they experience a fundamental breakdown of their identity. They are forced to confront the fact that their independence was a facade and that their clean break was actually a slow-motion car crash that they are only just now feeling the impact of. The concept of the safety of the true peer is perhaps the most devastating element of the avoidance collapse because it involves the loss of the only mirror in which they actually liked themselves. Most of the time, an avoidant individual navigates the world through a series of shallow or performance-based interactions where they are in total control of the narrative. They provide just enough of themselves to be liked or admired, but never enough to be truly known, which keeps them safe but also deeply invisible. However, every once in a while, they encounter a true peer, someone whose emotional intelligence, strength, and persistence allow them to see past the avoidant's defensive posturing. This person doesn't just fall for the mask, they recognize the human being behind it and offer a level of acceptance that the avoidant has spent a lifetime running away from yet secretly craving. When this relationship is active, the true peer functions as a psychological home base. For the avoidant, this person becomes the one place in the world where they don't have to constantly maintain the exhausting architecture of their false self. Because the peer has already seen their flaws and didn't flee, the avoidant feels a subconscious sense of safety that is entirely unique. This is the person who understood their silences, who knew when to push and when to give space, and who offered a consistent warmth that softened the avoidant's rigid edges. Losing this specific person isn't just a romantic setback, it is the loss of the only witness to their authentic self. Without that witness, the avoidant is left alone with a version of themselves they find deeply unsatisfying and a mask they no longer have the energy to wear. The vacuum of identity that follows this loss is profound because the avoidant's sense of worth was quietly being propped up by the peer's belief in them. When that person walks away, they take the safe version of the avoidant with them. The avoidant is suddenly thrust back into a world where everyone else only knows the superficial character they play. They realize with a chilling clarity that while they have plenty of friends or admirers, no one else actually knows who they are. This creates a terrifying sense of erasure. They start to feel like a ghost in their own life, surrounded by people who love a version of them that doesn't exist, while the one person who truly saw them is gone. This void cannot be filled with the typical avoidant distractions of work, casual dating, or travel, because those things only reinforce the superficiality they are now desperate to escape. As this realization sinks in, the avoidant experiences a total failure of their internal navigation system. Usually, they pride themselves on being self-sufficient and fine on their own, but the true peer provided a specific type of emotional oxygen they didn't realize they were breathing. In the absence of that person, the avoidant begins to suffocate under the weight of their own defenses. They find that the independence they once guarded so fiercely now feels like a prison cell. They look around at their life and see a landscape of shallow connections and empty achievements, none of which can provide the grounding force that the peer once did. The collapse occurs because they recognize that they didn't just lose a partner. They lost the only person who made the world feel like a place where they could actually exist as a real person. The final stage of this collapse is the confrontation with the permanence of their self-sabotage. Because the peer was a person of high value and integrity, they usually don't wait around forever. When they finally leave, they do so with a finality that the avoidant's ego can't bypass. The avoidant watches as the one person who truly understood them finds someone else who isn't afraid to be seen. This creates a paralyzing sense of regret that shatters the avoidant's self-concept. They are forced to acknowledge that their safety mechanisms were actually weapons of self-destruction. They didn't just push away a lover, they pushed away their own chance at being known. This realization is what prevents them from simply healing. They fall apart because they have to grieve not just the person, but the version of themselves they could have been if they hadn't been so afraid. The decompression effect is a psychological phenomenon that occurs when the structural support of a relationship is suddenly removed, leaving the avoidant individual to face the crushing weight of their own internal atmosphere. For years, the avoidant person may have viewed their partner's emotional presence as a source of pressure, a constant demand for intimacy that they felt they had to manage or resist. They perceived the partner's needs as a threat to their autonomy, not realizing that those very needs were providing a vital counter-pressure that kept the avoidance world balanced. When that person finally leaves, the avoidant expects to feel a sense of lightness and expansion. Instead, they experience a violent decompression. Without the emotional oxygen provided by the partner's consistent care and presence, the avoidant's internal system begins to buckle. they find that the independence they craved is actually a vacuum, and in a vacuum, nothing can survive. This collapse happens because the partner was secretly doing all the heavy lifting of the relationship's emotional labor. While the avoidant was busy maintaining boundaries and guarding their personal space, the partner was the one maintaining the connection, initiating the vulnerable conversations, and providing the safety net that allowed the avoidant to feel secure enough to be distant. Once that source of oxygen is cut off, the avoidant realizes they have no idea how to breathe on their own emotionally. They have spent so long reacting to someone else's warmth that they never learned how to generate their own. The sudden silence isn't peaceful. It is a suffocating lack of substance that makes every day feel like an uphill battle for basic emotional stability. They are like a deep-sea diver who has risen to the surface too quickly. The very environment they thought would be freedom is actually causing their entire internal structure to rupture. As the decompression sets in, the avoidant's usual coping mechanisms begin to fail one by one. In the past, they could retreat into their hobbies or their career because they knew deep down that there was a person waiting for them who cared. That person was the silent foundation upon which the avoidant built their life of independence. Now that the foundation is gone, the avoidant finds that they can no longer focus on work or find joy in their solitude. The activities that used to feel like a choice now feel like a forced march through a desert. They realize that their strength was actually a byproduct of the stability their partner provided. Without that stable external force to push against, the avoidant loses their sense of shape and direction. They become listless, unanchored, and increasingly desperate as they realize the pressure they hated was actually the only thing keeping them grounded. The total shutdown that follows is a defense mechanism against this overwhelming sense of emptiness. Because the avoidant doesn't know how to process the sudden loss of emotional regulation, their brain simply starts to turn off the lights. They might find themselves staring at walls for hours, unable to engage with the world, or feeling a sense of profound numbness that no amount of external stimulation can pierce. This isn't the cool indifference they use to project. This is a state of clinical shutdown where the nervous system has decided it is no longer safe to feel anything at all. They have reached the limit of their ability to self-soothe. The tragedy of the decompression effect is that it reveals the avoidant's total dependence on the very thing they claimed they didn't need. They are forced to sit in the wreckage of their life and acknowledge that they weren't the strong, solitary island they imagined themselves to be. This state of collapse is often permanent in the sense that it fundamentally breaks the avoidant's trust in their own defensive strategies. Once you have experienced the decompression, once you have felt the sheer terror of realizing your autonomy was a lie built on someone else's sacrifice, you can never truly go back to the old way of living. The avoidant falls apart because their entire worldview has been proven false. They realize that by pushing away the person who provided their oxygen, they effectively sabotage their own ability to exist in a healthy way. This loss doesn't just hurt, it creates a structural failure in their personality. They are left to grapple with the reality that the freedom they fought so hard for is actually a hollow, airless room where they are slowly losing the ability to feel, to connect, or to ever truly be at peace again. The regret paradox is the cruel irony that defines the final stages of an avoidance collapse, where the very independence they spent a lifetime protecting suddenly transforms into a self-imposed prison. Throughout their lives, avoidants treat their autonomy as a sacred fortress, viewing every bid for deep connection as an attempt to breach their walls and colonize their time, emotions, and identity. They spend years training themselves to be the person who needs nobody, believing that the peak of human existence is the ability to stand entirely alone, unaffected by the presence or absence of others. However, when they finally drive away the one person who truly understood and accepted them, the victory of that independence feels increasingly hollow. The silence they fought so hard to achieve stops being a sanctuary and starts being a tomb, as they realize that the independence they prioritized wasn't a form of strength, but a sophisticated form of hiding. This realization creates a devastating psychological loop where the avoidant is forced to confront the fact that they have effectively won a war they never should have been fighting. In the heat of the relationship, they viewed their partner's desire for closeness as a burden or a chore, something to be managed through distancing, ghosting, or emotional withdrawal. They convinced themselves that they were better off alone because they wouldn't have to answer to anyone or consider anyone else's feelings. But once the partner finally accepts the rejection and disappears, the avoidant is left with the one thing they always wanted: total, uninterrupted solitude. The paradox lies in the discovery that this solitude only has value when it is a choice made within the context of being loved. Without the safety net of a person who cares, being alone shifts from a restorative state to a state of profound existential abandonment. The weight of this regret is amplified by the specific memory of the person they pushed away. Avoidants don't fall apart over every loss. They fall apart over the loss of the one who made them feel safe in their vulnerability. As time passes, the avoidant stops remembering the partner as a source of pressure and starts seeing them as the only person who was ever willing to sit outside their walls and wait for the drawbridge to drop. They begin to replay every moment where they chose distance over intimacy, every time they looked at a reach for connection and saw it as a demand rather than a gift. This creates a relentless internal dialogue of what if that they cannot escape. They realize they pushed away the only person who actually saw the frightened child behind the cold mask, and in doing so, they have ensured that they will likely never be seen that way again. The collapse deepens as the avoidant watches their former partner move on to someone who values the very things the avoidant rejected. Seeing the person they lost give their warmth, their patience, and their deep commitment to someone else acts as a mirror that reflects the avoidant's own perceived brokenness. They are forced to admit that the problem wasn't the partner's neediness or intensity, but their own inability to receive love. The independence they once wore as a badge of honor now feels like a scarlet letter, a sign that they are fundamentally incapable of participating in the most meaningful aspect of the human experience. They are trapped in a reality where they have all the freedom in the world, but no one to share it with and no reason to believe they will ever find that specific level of safety again. Ultimately, the regret paradox shatters the avoidant's ego because it destroys the narrative of their own superiority. They can no longer tell themselves that they are more evolved or more stable than the anxious people they dated. They are forced to look at the wreckage of their life and acknowledge that they are the architects of their own loneliness. This is why they don't just heal, they fall apart under the realization that their greatest achievement, their total self-reliance, is actually their greatest failure. They sit in the quiet of their perfectly controlled life, staring at the phone that no longer rings with the names of the people who truly cared, realizing that they have finally achieved the independence they wanted, only to find that it is the most painful thing they have ever experienced. The finality trigger is the moment the avoidant's internal architecture suffers a structural failure because the door they assumed would always be left cracked open is finally and firmly slammed shut. Throughout their lives, avoidants operate on a subconscious assumption that they are the prize and that their distance makes them more desirable. They view the people who love them as permanent fixtures who will indefinitely tolerate their withdrawal, their hot and cold behavior, and their refusal to commit. This creates a false sense of security, where the avoidant feels they have all the time in the world to figure themselves out while their partner waits in the wings. However, when they encounter a high-value partner who eventually reaches their breaking point and walks away for good, the avoidant is forced into a confrontation with reality that no amount of psychological defense can mitigate. This loss is different because it represents a permanent end to the safe world they had built, forcing them to look at the wreckage of their attachment style without the buffer of a second chance. This specific loss triggers a total collapse because it acts as a mirror that the avoidant can no longer look away from or distort. In previous relationships, they might have blamed the partner for being too needy or too demanding, using those labels as a way to avoid self-reflection. But when the loss feels final, the excuses stop working. They can no longer tell themselves the story that they just haven't met the right person yet. Instead, they are hit with the chilling realization that they are the common denominator in their own isolation. This finality strips away the illusion of control that is central to the avoidant identity. They realize that while they were busy playing games of distance and power, the other person was doing the actual work of living and loving, and that person has now evolved past them. The avoidant is left standing still in a world that has moved on, realizing that their safety was actually a form of stagnation that has cost them everything. The psychological impact of this trigger is catastrophic because it forces a confrontation with the why behind their behavior. For years, the avoidant has avoided their own trauma by focusing on the perceived flaws of others. When the finality hit, there is no one else to focus on. They are trapped in a room with their own history, their own fears, and the undeniable evidence of their own self-sabotage. This leads to a profound ego death. The person who once took pride in being unfazed and independent now sees themselves as someone who is fundamentally broken and unable to participate in the warmth of human connection. The pain is so intense because it isn't just grief for a lost partner. It is a mourning for the person they could have been if they hadn't been so terrified of intimacy. They realize they have spent their lives building a fortress that has now become their tomb, and the person who had the key has finally thrown it away. During this collapse, the avoidant often attempts to return to their old patterns of rebounding or seeking shallow validation, but the finality of this specific loss makes those efforts feel empty and even disgusting. The distractions that used to provide a temporary high now feel like a pathetic admission of their inability to be alone with themselves. They find that they can no longer lie to new partners or even to themselves about what they want. The weight of the finality trigger has crushed their ability to perform the charming but distant character they have played for so long. They are forced into a